So hopefully everybody can now see my screen where we will begin today's webinar. So to introduce myself first, my name's Vicky Williams. I am the Partnerships Manager here at LMP. LMP recently joined the Supporting Education Group. So we are quite a big organisation, but what I like to say is SEG is big enough to make impact, whereas LMP is still small enough to matter about what we do and care about every individual that we connect with. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague Martha, who will introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name's Martha. I'm Associate Sales Director over at LMP. And yeah, just to echo on what Vicky said, we really love working with schools and trusts to kind of develop and really meet the needs of the sector at the moment. So I'll pass over to Kana.
Hello, hi. My name's Keena Adkins. I'm currently the Deputy Director of a trust that is in the East Midlands. Previously a head teacher for a number of years in a large special school. Looking forward to talking together today.
And I'm very excited to have you on the call, actually, because what you bring is not only a look in terms of the SEND provision, but actually from a mainstream point as well. So hopefully we'll have some really good conversation. So to kickstart us then, so I think what's really important is before we look at what the reforms could mean in practice, it's really helpful if we can understand why the government has decided to make changes and why change is necessary. So in February this year, the Department of Education published two key documents. The first being the SEND White Paper, named Every Child Achieving and Thriving. And the second was a consultation called Putting Children and Young People First. And together, these documents outline the government's vision in terms of the future of SEND and what that will look like across England. At the heart of the proposals is a recognition that the current system isn't working consistently for many children, young people and families. And too often support can be difficult to access. Needs aren't being identified early enough, and families can find themselves navigating through really complex and sometimes really frustrating processes in order to get the support that their children need. Government has also highlighted the kind of wider consequences to those struggles, and that includes where needs aren't being met effectively, an increase in school absence, disengagement from learning, and ultimately a gap in opportunities and outcomes for children and young people with additional needs. So the ambition set out in these reforms is to move towards a more inclusive system. So one where needs are identified earlier, support is more consistent regardless of where a child lives, which is very important, and that children and young people receive the right help at the right time and are given the opportunity to achieve and participate fully in education and thrive. So that's the landscape. Now, there are some key themes and priorities within the reform, and that includes a new tiered framework of 3 levels of support that now go beyond just the universal offer. And what it allows is for children to receive support from more than one level and actually transition flexibly through those tiers to meet their evolving needs. So we have Tier 1, which includes kind of small group intervention-based, evidence-informed strategies, and we find that those will be delivered by school staff. The next tier is Targeted Plus. So this includes the new Expert at Hand service, which looks to bring together the expertise and advice from services across education and health professionals, such as speech and language and occupational therapists, and they will bring that into the mainstream classroom. And then we have the specialist tier as well, which provides support nationally which provides support and is nationally defined as the specialist provision packages. Sorry, a mouthful there. Also known as SPPs. So the provision set out in an SPP will underpin the entitlement within an EHCP plan. So that's the Educational Healthcare Plan. Now, this tiered approach will also sit alongside new individual support plans, which is, if you've been around for a while, seems familiar. We seem to have gone back to that. There are improved EHCPs. Funding will go directly to schools now through the new Inclusive Mainstream Fund. There's a new national inclusion standards. Stronger multi-agency collaboration is a key theme, and enhanced post-16 support. And the idea of these is all about creating that more consistent, inclusive and responsive SEND system that we're striving. So no small task, okay? So a very big task. Now, here is how that change is likely to be delivered. So at the heart of the white paper is the recognition that improving outcomes for children cannot be done by schools alone. This government's approach is a whole system reform. So it's bringing together education, health, social care, youth services, families, and everybody around the needs of children. And there are 4 key strands. The first strand focuses on wrapping support around children and families. So schools will now be positioned as community anchors, which many are already, but they will bring services together rather than working in isolation. And the aim is to create real accountability and collective accountability for the outcomes and support that our children and family can access. The second strand is about broadening opportunity. So the government wants to move away from a narrow definition of educational success and ensure that every child benefits from really strong early years foundations. So that includes a broad and knowledge-rich curriculum, high quality teaching and learning, enrichment opportunities, smoother transitions throughout their educational journey. And then the third strand is big. The third strand is all around inclusion, which is a main focus around the SEND reform, with significant investment in mainstream inclusion, earlier identification of needs, improved access to specialist support, and more consistent provision across the country. The ambition is to move away from that system where support quite often depends on how hard a family fights, to one where needs are identified and met earlier and more consistently. And then finally, the government wants to improve engagement, and that includes strengthening relationships with schools and families, improving attendance and behaviour, introducing a new pupil engagement framework, and ensuring that children feel a real sense of belonging in school. And belonging is key. I know, Kenya, you will touch on that, I've no doubts. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Martha to look at what schools and trusts can do now to prepare.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, so we've spoken about what's changing, but the question most school leaders, when we're talking to them, are asking is, what does that mean for us in reality from September? I think the good news is that many schools are already doing elements of this really, really well. The reforms aren't asking to start from scratch, and they're asking everyone to become more consistent, more collaborative, and more proactive in how we're supporting children day to day. The first area is developing that inclusive practice, about making sure inclusive teaching isn't just the responsibility of the SEND team, and that every member of staff really feels confident in adapting their teaching, recognising the different needs and creating environments where every child can thrive. Secondly, schools should be reviewing their identification and record keeping process. With the introduction of the individual support plans, making sure you have them clear, consistent systems for identifying need, recording support, and tracking progress will become more and more important. Another really key area is that multi-agency partnerships and strengthening them relationships. Reforms place a huge emphasis on education, health and social care working together. And that means having really strong relationships with people like educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, your LA teams and other professionals, and making sure that referral pathways are really joined up when they're creating plans. Equally important is enhancing the relationships with parents and carers. All the families need to feel like they're really involved, not just when concerns arise, but consistently throughout, and building that trust and open communication in making plans to support children will be really central there. We're also seeing a real emphasis on workforce development. The reforms recognise that creating an inclusive system isn't just about new policies, it's about making sure your staff have the knowledge, confidence to put these all into practice. So this means investing in professional development around neurodiversity, speech and language, SEMH, adaptive teaching, and building real SEND leadership. That's just not within the SENDCO team, so beyond that. And finally, there's a much stronger focus on attendance, belonging and engagement. Rather than simply looking at attendance figures, schools are encouraged to understand the why people might be disengaging, reviewing behaviour through that inclusion lens and creating an environment where every child really feels like they belong. So ultimately, the reforms are asking schools to move away from reacting to the need that appears in front of them, to identifying it earlier, intervening sooner, and building a workforce that has real confidence to respond effectively.
Fabulous, thank you. So Kina, if I could invite you to join us in this discussion now. I think we've learned a lot and a lot of information giving there, but we've learned a lot around the kind of plans and the proposed implementation. And I'd like to ask you some questions now around the kind of questions that we're seeing across the sector. So the first one is, and this really comes from a LinkedIn post that I saw that simply said, we need to build the classroom infrastructure that meets the need of every learner while creating an inclusive learning environment. And I thought that sounds really great in principle, but what do you feel are the biggest implementation challenges, and how can organisations kind of set themselves up to overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, it's all the right things, it's all the right direction, and I don't think there's any organisation that would disagree with the principles behind what is being trying to achieve. I think primarily the biggest challenge is around recruiting, retaining, training the right adults to work with an increasing complex cohort of pupils coming through the education system. We need to think more carefully and creatively about how we get some really talented people through into our system. There are so many people out there that I know have got the right skills, the right qualities, the right values to work with pupils with SEND. But sometimes the systems, the way in which we get people into teaching isn't yet caught up with that. So I know that the apprenticeship teacher model has come in, which I know is going to begin to think about how we do that. But also looking at our teaching assistants and our wider organisation workforce. Many of the adults that will work with pupils with SEND will be expected to do things that you wouldn't typically expect to be done in a mainstream classroom. Complex intimate care, for example, clinical supervision around administration of medication, thinking about the complexities of some of the challenging behaviours that can present with some pupils. These techniques, strategies, skills and qualities that are needed need to be trained. We can't just cross our fingers and hope that somehow magic happens. So I definitely think training, recruitment, retention, and fundamentally changing the way we look at the adults that work with children within schools. I've previously worked in secondary, mainstream secondary, so I'm very familiar with the secondary sector. And that comes with a whole range of different complexities when you're working with older pubescent teenagers who may have difficulties, disabilities or differences that make it difficult to be able to have that genuinely, truly inclusive practice. So I think for me, it's about looking at the adults first. But secondly, it's without question, it's looking at the wider organisations that are around us. For the education system to take on the extra responsibility of being the anchor, we cannot do it in silo. We need to work much more closely with our social care and our health colleagues, because it is an education, health and social care plan, not just an education plan. So I think for me, that's one of the main things. Secondly, unfortunately, money does come into it. Thinking about the infrastructure of buildings, some of the smaller schools, particularly primary schools, they may have the beautiful, old buildings that are not able to be as easily converted into spaces that would suit pupils. So size, but also the infrastructure in terms of the equipment and the kit that might be required to be able to give pupils what they need within the classroom or within the wider elements of the school. That can be everything from sensory needs, thinking about acoustic panels, thinking about the entrance to school and how we ensure that the environment meets the needs of those pupils. The corridors need to be wide enough for wheelchairs. The toilets need to be big enough to be able to have a changing bed in, so that young people don't have to lay on a mat on a floor. So there's a huge amount of work to do in terms of money and the infrastructure of buildings. And then finally, I think it is about working together across all sectors. So our mainstream colleagues working more closely with our special school colleagues and really developing a partnership where we are one service and we learn from each other, both proactively and reactively when situations arise.
Amazing. You've kind of answered some of my, like, not in the same words, some of my the next question I was going to ask you, because obviously the SEND reform places significant emphasis on teachers' development to like create that expertise to make the whole education system inclusive. But like you've already kind of touched on it slightly, but given like the really vital role of your TAs, your pastoral teams, then wider support staff play in like kind of identifying needs and delivering interventions, is enough currently being done to invest and develop in the wider workforce to make the SEND reform as successful as it needs to be?
No is the simple answer, but it's not for want of trying. I think everybody is recognising that this is an area of development. I think at every level of strategic leadership, we need to be considering this as our primary area of focus. I think the complexity comes by the range of need. So within our trust, we have a number of primary schools, a number of secondary schools, and 8 special schools, 4 of which are predominantly for pupils with social, emotional, mental health needs, and another 4 with a complex range of generic needs, and that can range from life-limiting medical conditions right the way through complex autism with associated challenging behaviours, and for those pupils that may be blind or have a significant hearing impairment as well. So the challenge is so vast, and I think schools I know experience real challenge. The amount of training days that schools have to be able to train staff. Of course, we want children in as much as we possibly can across a year, but typically schools can only have up to around about 5 days worth of training. And I know certainly within the special school sector, for our staff to be trained in behaviour management strategies, for example, that's usually a 2-day course. Being able to be trained to drive minibuses requires a specific qualification. The ability to be able to administer a complex medication not only requires the original training, but then the health services need to come out and observe the practice over a period of time. So this is a time constraint that comes with training. But then on top of that, I think it's looking at the cost that's associated with some of this training that comes. These organisations that provide the training are quite a niche market at the moment, and schools are really much forced into, well, they have to pay it out because it really is necessary. And so I think we need to think carefully about how we support the education sector in making it financially viable to be able to provide all of our staff with the necessary training. And that's everybody from the receptionist through to the site manager, through to our midday supervisors, or the cooks that have to blend food or provide complex allergy systems. And all of those staff that have to respond to quite, significant emergency situations, such as a serious incident of epilepsy or a serious incident of a child going into crisis. And then on top of that, we also have the need for staff to be skilled in being able to work with families. Sometimes, as you said earlier, the barrier to pupils making that progress because they don't want to attend, but the barriers that exist for them are so complex. And so having the infrastructure within a school to be able to have the right people to go and work with those families, make those adjustments, build those relationships, and encourage them to come either into school or into a space where they can have their education in a slightly different way. And I think it's really important. We need to think about education in whatever way works for that child, whether that be they are in hospital with leukemia and they're unable to access school, but they could join via Teams. We need the systems and the people to have those skills to be able to use the technology to be able to do that. So the list is endless. There is lots to do to continue to develop the skill and expertise of what is already a very skilled staff workforce.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just from your input there, actually, we hear the scope of what's needed. So yeah, not, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a small task, is it? But I feel really at peace with the fact that everybody in this sector that I come across is very passionate and goes above and beyond what they need to. So we have the right people in sector. As you say, it's how do we then retain them and train them so that they can do the best that they can. So now a big topic and now a big question, actually. If there was one practical change that you think organisations could implement tomorrow that would have the biggest impact in terms of inclusion, what would that be?
I think the word inclusion is really interesting because you can exclude someone by trying to include them. And I think we need to really be sensible about what we actually mean by inclusion. We have to think about pupils' starting points, and that's not just their academic starting points. We need to think about their emotional starting point, their physical starting points, what they can and they can't do. And we need to just start there, start with the starting points, work harder to understand their strengths and their difficulties, and then think creatively about what's out there to be able to begin the journey of success. And for many pupils, that success may take many, many years to move from the ability to hold their spoon in their hand through to using their knife and fork. That could take 2 key stages, but also thinking about inclusivity of pupils that physically look different, or pupils that may socially present different. Our world needs to be more inclusive. When we see autistic young people and young adults who are out in the world and they're stimming because they're really enjoying themselves, but to people who aren't familiar what that presentation looks like, that might feel a bit uncomfortable, a bit overwhelming. So we need to do everything from the granular small things right the way through to the really, really big things in terms of society as well. But it is about looking at those starting points, making sure that the children have the right people around them who have the right skill and the right intent to be able to do what's right for that child, not to do it because Ofsted says you need to be inclusive. You need to do it because it's the right thing to do. And on Ofsted, I would say I'm really pleased to hear that and to see that the Ofsted Inclusion Toolkit now includes a full element of inclusion within its inspection framework. I think that's a real celebration and a really positive direction, albeit a challenge for schools. I think it really is raising the bar and raising the expectations that we have a duty to include everybody in whatever way that looks.
Thank you. Thank you. So if we move on then from the questions, because lots to digest there. We at LMP recently did some market research around kind of the workforce and where there are skills and confidence gaps in terms of that. And we were very excited to introduce the new early interventions practitioner to our portfolio. We believe that one of the most important foundations for successfully delivering the SEND reforms as well is about that kind of workforce capability. and where the direction seems to be going around that kind of earlier identification, earlier intervention, and more consistent support for children and young people, then that's exactly where this level 4 early interventions practitioner program comes in. So this program specifically has been designed to develop the knowledge, skills and confidence needed to identify emerging needs early, and to work collaboratively with families and professionals and put the right support in place before challenges escalate. So it focuses on that early help rather than crisis intervention. And as the SEND system evolves, organisations will need practitioners who can create the inclusive kind of preventative approach outlined in the government's reform. The early interventions practitioner apprenticeship supports that exact ambition, and we've built that in terms of the workforce is equipped to improve outcomes, reduce barriers to learning, and ensure children and young people are receiving the support at the earliest possible stage. So with this programme, candidates will focus on key themes, including the identification of early warning signs in attendance, building positive relationships with pupils and families, communicating effectively with parents and carers, working with multi-agencies, and that includes kind of early help and SEND teams. And then also looking at maintaining accurate records and using data to inform decisions, managing a caseload and prioritising support, using restorative and relational approaches. The list goes on in terms of those key themes that are within that programme. We specifically built this programme for people that are in inclusion roles, attendance leads, people welfare staff, family support workers, behaviour support workers, pastoral leads, heads of year, safeguarding. It's very much around everybody in that position where they can have an impact in terms of that early identification. Okay. Now, the intended impact for this programme is that it will improve attendance. It will strengthen kind of behaviour and the de-escalation practices across schools. And it is all around that kind of earlier identification of risk, as I said. We want to be able to better support our vulnerable pupils and have that improved inclusion approach. So, and we feel confident that we're going to get that. We have, as I say, part of the development of this programme was we listened to the sector and we did a lot of research around what we need, and we spoke to colleagues in the sector in these roles. So I really feel like we're going to have a lot of impact with this. And now, excitingly, we also have some other programmes which I'm going to hand over to Martha to highlight.
So I want to talk about our level 5 specialist teaching assistant programme. It really is the flagship within our SEND offer, and we designed it. It's been designed for experienced teaching assistants who are ready to really delve deeper into their expertise and become specialists within their schools. So this programme we've actually been delivering since January last year, January 25, and we're really proud that we've had our first apprentice successfully complete and then a few more after, and the first one got a distinction. But what's been amazing to see is the confidence they've developed, the impact they're having in the school, being able to support colleagues, influencing their practice and making a bigger difference to the pupils they work with every day. So that's fantastic. It really, so within the standard level 5 programme, you specialise in one of 3 pathways, that's SEND, SEMH or curriculum. Rather than just kind of supporting pupils day to day, the learners really develop knowledge and confidence to become specialists within their areas, and they learn how to assess needs, adapt provision, work collaboratively with teachers and families and help drive that inclusive practice. So kind of linking right into how schools are preparing for the SEND reform, this goes hand in hand, and where there's that increased expectation for mainstream settings to meet a broader range of needs. Developing them specialisms within house, within your existing workforce is a really sustainable way of doing that. As we've been delivering the programme over the last 18 months, we've been really listening closely to schools to hear about where they need even greater specialist expertise. So one message well, a couple of messages kind of came through really consistently. And school told us that while the SEND pathway is really valuable, there are two areas where they were seeing increasing levels of need, and that's autism and speech and language. So that's why we've developed these two really exciting new pathways. Both sit within that level 5 programme. Our first one is the Autism Support Practitioner pathway, where there's more and more autistic pupils being educated within mainstream settings than ever before. Schools really need staff who understand more than simply what autism is. They need practitioners who understand sensory processing, communication differences, emotional regulation, and can confidently adapt classrooms to remove barriers and learning support, to like create genuine inclusion rather than just simply providing just additional support. Alongside that, we've developed the speech and language support practitioner pathway, which I've heard so many times when I've gone out to schools about how essential it is, and I've got first-hand experience of the need within my own family. So speech and language really underpins everything that children do within learning. And if a child struggles to communicate, it impacts their literacy, behaviour, relationships, and ultimately their ability to kind of get engaged with the curriculum. The pathways develops practitioners who can identify them communication needs earlier on, implement strategies and intervention, and work alongside your speech and language therapists in the classroom day to day, creating them practical strategies to make a real immediate difference. So ultimately, these programs aren't about creating a new qualification, but they're really about creating specialist expertise within schools, in your workforce, to understand the pupils that you're supporting day to day, and then share that knowledge with your colleagues across the schools and trusts. What makes these programs different? The programs are practical. Everything learners complete is based on real situations they're already dealing with in school. They're not just learning theory, they're immediately applying it within the children and families they support every day. Secondly, we take learners through the entire support journey, from identifying need and assessing risk throughout the planning interventions, working with families and professionals and reviewing what has the greatest impact. And the kind of key thing, which I've mentioned already, is building that expertise within, rather than relying solely on external services. You're like building that specialism within. And finally, where like several staff complete these programs across the trust, everyone's working from the same evidence-based approaches and using the same languages and processes, which ultimately leads to better outcomes for.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think where this is an apprenticeship standard and it's work-based learning, what we see is that quick succession in terms of we will stretch the knowledge and understanding around legislation, strategies, the theory. This then looks at the practical application of that. So how are we putting that into practice? And I think throughout the programs, and especially with the specialist teaching assistant level 5 that we've already seen, deliver good results, is quite quick that schools are seeing the impact of that kind of understanding and knowledge and then applying that in practice. Thank you. So how training works for us at LMP. So we're very much employer-led. All of our programs are structured around kind of one-to-one timetables that you have, but typically we will deliver facilitated online workshops and have monthly coaching sessions with an experienced for the pastoral support practitioner. The early interventions practitioner, it would be with an experienced pastoral practitioner assessor that would support you through that program. And then we also have a whole host of online resources that look very interactive. So it's webinars, it's links to podcasts, it's additional reading, it's, connections, go and speak to this person at this trust, and really building that community, whilst building a portfolio of evidence that demonstrates all of that training and, as I said before, that applied knowledge into practice. Typically, all apprenticeship standards have that practical period, and then we go through an endpoint assessment. That is up in the air at the moment, so we are changing the way, and what we're finding is we're going back to the more integrated assessment now. So rather than having to do a final endpoint assessment at the end of a programme, we're doing more of an integrated assessment. And a benefit of that, I feel, is that includes the employers. So the employers can actually have a real input into whether their staff member has got the skills and the behaviours as demonstrated and required in the apprenticeship standard to confidently, achieve the qualification. Now, we, as I said, we are part of Supporting Education Group at LMP. We're big on kind of building the career development frameworks for support staff. And I think if we reflect on what we've spoke about today, it is not a small task, and I keep saying that, but it really isn't a small task. But we have got the right people, and we've got great people in the sector that I know will take this challenge on confidently, and won't rest until the children have what they need. Part of our offer is we try and build those career frameworks, as I say. So on the screen, you can see all of the apprenticeship standards that we have on offer, which are funded through the apprenticeship levy. Have a look. If you go on to our website, you'll be able to access this and more detail on each of our programs. But the nice thing is, if we take a TA role, for example, we can bring somebody in. And as you touched on before, Kana, it's about retaining and upskilling staff members. So we, through our provision, can bring in a TA at level 3 and have a pathway all the way through to teacher, even head teacher, maybe even CEO, who knows. But through our kind of wider Supporting Education Group companies, we can achieve that, and that's really exciting. So do have a look on the website. There's lots of useful information on there, and we've got lots of case studies on there as well, so you can hear real life experiences. And also we've got a wonderful blog, which a colleague of mine works very hard to make sure that we are putting out some really detailed and important information. So do go on the blog as well and have a look at that. So if we can go to the chat, do we have any questions in the chat?
I think we do. Some of them I think we've answered. So are these courses fully funded? Yes, is the answer, hopefully through your apprenticeship levy. If your trust or local authority has used all of that, that we can help with levy gifting, but generally they're all funded through the apprenticeship levy. Most of them have also been answered. Does anyone else have any other questions for us or for Kana while we're here? Oh. So someone said, if you could recommend just one apprenticeship programme for a mainstream school that's trying to become more inclusive over the next 12 months, which would it be and why?
That's a very good question. That is a very good question. What would I say? I'm going to give my answer, and then Kana, I might come to you and see what you think, actually. I'm going to say the specialist teaching assistant. Actually, I think that the role of a teaching assistant has evolved, and it looks so different to what it did 10 years ago, 5 years ago even. It's such a vital role. And where we see there is increasing pressure on teachers, the adaptations a teacher needs to make in the classroom now is huge. That actually being able to utilize TAs more effectively will allow us to build that infrastructure, that inclusive infrastructure. And the TA5, as Martha touched on before, we've got some real specific pathways that can allow people to specialise and build that partnership. That's what we're moving towards, is that collaborative approach. And I feel that would have a great impact. Do we agree?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for those teaching assistants to develop those unique and really important skills. For me, I think we all recognise in the sector that speech, language, and communication is quite difficult to reach out to those that health sector at the moment. The waiting list can be quite long. The complexity of those communication needs can be very vast. If we can close the gap on speech language deficits, particularly in the early years, I think that makes such a huge difference for the children when they go through their school career. What I'm excited about that particular post is the ability to work with the speech and language colleagues from health, but also to work with multiple staff within the school and disseminate that learning and that experience. And I think for me, the impact is is great, where one person can go around, you know, everything from EYFS through to year 6, for example, and really demonstrate that impact either in the classroom, working alongside the adults, providing that you know, identification and assessment at an earlier point, to be able to then put those recommendations in and work with the health professionals. So they all sound great, but that one for me would be a really interesting one for schools to take on.
Yeah, I think we're really excited about launching that because the demand for it has been so consistent across all of our partners, and it is that difference, because you might have some clinical time of around 15 minutes a week per child, but then being able to keep them strategies and activities going throughout the week will really change the rate in which you see a difference, and that's really exciting. We've had another question in. Is there any training to support schools with identifying TEEs with SEMH, with a focus on early identification and intervention? I'll answer it. I suppose the early interventions practitioner should help with that, because obviously that would help with early interventions, like with identifying the need earlier on. But then I suppose also hand in hand the specialist teaching assistant program, where the focus is your social, emotional, mental health, would support that. Vicky, I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where you've specifically asked around teens there, absolutely, this program lends itself to a whole, you know, early interventions in all forms, not just in schools. So there is a question around, is it suitable for early years as well? Absolutely. At any point where there is connection and you know, support of a young person or a young adult, child, young person or adult, absolutely, the early intervention is very suitable, and it crosses over even into, you know, adult social care. So yes, definitely is the answer to that, I would say. Fabulous. So I think that is all the questions that we've got, and we're very timely. So we've got 2 minutes remaining. So any final thoughts from anyone, or any more questions, do put them in the chat. No?
First of all, yeah, thanks for inviting me to join to have this discussion. It sounds like there's lots of great things going on, and I wish all of our education colleagues all the best in their endeavours for inclusivity.
Yes, thank you. It's been absolutely delightful to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining and bringing your expertise and your thoughts. I keep saying it, and I'll say it one more time. This isn't a small task, but I know with people like yourselves, you know, up for the challenge, we will absolutely get there. And I think for anybody on the call that is part of a school, a trust, and if you do feel that there is a gap in the sector or within the training needs, please do reach out. As I say, we are part of the Support and Education Group, so we're big enough to make an impact, and we can really look at filling those gaps and working with you to build whatever that training is. So do reach out. Thank you for your time, everyone. Thank you, Martha. Hope you found this webinar useful. It will be shared and shared out with everybody that's attended today. So yeah, there we are. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, guys.